If you spend any time at all working on a ladder, you begin to learn just some basic principles of physics. I mean, right? When you're on the lower rungs of the ladder, those first few ones, it feels pretty stable and secure. You can move around easily because the center of gravity is down low. But if you climb up high, especially if you're standing on the top, where they, now they put the warnings. They say you shouldn't go that high, but you do it anyway because you want to, you need to reach something. It starts to get really wobbly, and yet that doesn't stop people, right? They get comfortable with it. They get overconfident, and then they reach too far out to grab something. And if the ladder passes that tipping point, it's going to come crashing down. Well, I think that same dynamic applies to other areas of life. I mean, as people become successful, as they gain power or influence or resources to whatever degree, they take greater risks. And as fallen human beings, it's just our nature to become overconfident and to reach too far. And so Proverbs 16:18 warns us, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. And many of the Psalms we've been studying come from David's time when he was fleeing from King Saul. And they show us how he prayed in moments when he wasn't successful, when he was in terrible straits. But Saul ended up falling in battle to the Philistines, and when that happened, David began to climb the ladder, so to speak, of political power. He ruled for 7 years over his own tribe, the tribe of Judah, and then he became king over all of Israel. And God was giving him great success. But I think he got to a point where he maybe reached too far. 2 Samuel chapter 8 describes David's victories over the surrounding nations. He defeated the Philistines. They were to the west of Israel, and the Moabites over to the east. And then he marched his armies far to the northeast to fight the Arameans, and then to the south to fight the Edomites. And so Psalm 60 was written during that time as all these battles were taking place. And the superscript of the psalm says this: to the choir master, according to Shushan Eduth, a miktam of David for instruction when he strove with Aram Naharaim and with Aram Zobah, and when Joab on his return struck down 12,000 of Edom in the valley of Salt. So lots of unusual words in there to try to figure out, but that first part where it talks about according to Shushan Eduth, that could be just maybe a tune or something, or a theme. It means something like Lily of the Covenant. And so I suspect it has something, he's talking about how the blessings of God and his promises are unfolding. A miktam, we've seen in the last few Psalms, it has to do with a writing or an inscription, and this one specifically for instruction. And then it's talking about these battles with the Arameans. It mentions the two locations there, and then the Edomites. And when you just take that superscript, or if you read in 2 Samuel or in 1 Chronicles, everything sounds positive. It sounds like nothing but victory for David until you read this psalm. Psalm 60, it becomes clear that what happened was, it seems like the Edomites, so they're in the south, that they invaded Judah, David's homeland, while he was up fighting these Arameans off in the northeast. And so he left his people vulnerable to attack. And in the midst of what seems to be this growing success, he has this defeat. These invaders sweep in. And so, as it says there in the superscript we just read, Joab, he was the commander of David's army, was ultimately able to gain victory, but the psalm records how David prays when he first gets the bad news about this invasion. Now, again, that seems far afield from our lives, right? Not like daily life for us at all. But I think the connection point for us is that we've all had times when life seemed to be going well, and then you're making progress to your goals, maybe you're getting more confident, but then something unexpected blindsides you. You know, it knocks the wind out of you, whether maybe it's an accident, maybe it's a sickness, maybe it's a loss of some sort. How did you respond in that moment of defeat? And more importantly, how would you respond differently when it happens again? Because I think David's prayer here in Psalm 60 teaches us 3 lessons about how to respond, about how to think in those moments of defeat. So my prayer is that God would use them to help us stand firm. The first lesson is to recognize God's discipline. You know, under the right conditions, a healthy plant grows and it shoots out in every direction. And yet that kind of rapid growth can create problems. It's like with trees, right? If it shoots out too quickly, the branches may not be strong enough to hold up the weight of all the leaves. A strong wind comes and breaks it, right? Or if it's a fruit-bearing plant, the growth can drain away energy from the production of fruit. And so for thousands of years, gardeners have understood that pruning is required for a plant to be healthy and productive. And in the New Testament, John 15, verses 1 and 2 tells us that Jesus used that picture of pruning to explain how God disciplines believers. Jesus said, "I am the true vine. My Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me," that's us, "that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit." So the idea is God's the master gardener, right? He knows what we need to be spiritually healthy and to be fruitful. And if we begin to stray too far from his design for us, he'll bring circumstances into our life that draw us back to him, that make us cling tighter to him. Now, even going back into the Old Testament, David's son Solomon recognized that God's discipline like that flows from his love for us. In Proverbs 3, 11 and 12, he said, "My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline or be weary of his reproof, for the Lord reproves him whom he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights." But that doesn't make it any easier, though. Right? I mean, it's encouraging to know that of God's love, to know that that's what motivates his discipline, but those moments can still be blindingly painful. And that's what we see here in Psalm 60. After David learned of this attack, he just expresses his hurt to the Lord. He pours it out here in these first 5 verses of the psalm. Take a look, Psalm 60, verses 1 through 5. He prays and says, "Oh God, you've rejected us, broken our defenses. You've been angry. Oh, restore us. You've made the land to quake. You've torn it open. Repair its breaches, for it totters. You've made your people see hard things. You've given us wine to drink that made us stagger. You've set up a banner for those who fear you, that they may flee to it from the bow." Selah means pause. "That your beloved ones may be delivered, give salvation by your right hand and answer us." So, I mean, the Edomites, this neighboring nation, they were the ones responsible for the attack. But David recognized that God was using it as a disciplinary act. I mean, you look back through those verses that we just read, and at least in our English translation, it has the words "you have" 7 times, right? David saw these events as an expression of God's anger over something that they had done. Somehow, in their success, they were drifting from the Lord. And so he realized that that this was a sense of rejection from all of these events transpiring. And so it hit them. He uses these great pictures. First, like an earthquake. What does that mean? Well, an earthquake's never expected. You never know when one's coming. It's out of the blue, right? Things just begin to shake. Walls come crumbling down, right? And that may have even been happening literally there, that as these attackers were coming and attacking cities in Judah, the people were left devastated and fearful, right? It showed them that they weren't firmly grounded in the Lord the way that they should have been. And then David says the effect upon them as a nation was like being drunk. Right? What does that mean? Well, I mean, when people are drunk, they don't really contain their emotions very well, right? They see hard things or something sad happens and they just kind of fall apart. They were in sort of a mental fog as a nation. They were staggering around with no sense of balance, no sense of stability or direction. I mean, isn't it that way when hard times hit? It's just so disorienting. When something goes wrong, it just feels like you can't even see straight. And yet, even as David's talking about this, it's clear that he knows that God wasn't rejecting them entirely. Because he uses that next picture in verse 4. He talks about God setting up a banner. And I think the idea of that is on the battlefield in ancient times, a banner, a bright banner, troops would see that. They'd know where to go, where to rally together. And so it was in a sense that's what's happening here. Those who feared the Lord, they knew where to flee when these trials hit. And the chaos of this defeat, they could run to him. Moses used that same kind of picture back when Israel had their first battle after leaving Egypt. He proclaimed, "The Lord is my banner." God draws his people together. He enables us to move forward in those hard times. And so as David prays here, it's like he's running back to that banner. He's coming back to the Lord. And he says in verse 5, he knows that the people of Israel were God's beloved ones. Right? Because God had chosen them and established his covenant with them. He wouldn't give up on them. He's faithful to his promises. And so even with this terrible defeat, David wasn't giving up. He was praying, he was pleading with God for restoration and deliverance and salvation. So for us then, how do you view those times of defeat? Do you recognize them as part of God's disciplinary process in your life? Because even in the New Testament, we're told to view it that way. Hebrews 12 talks about it. The author compares God, just like the proverb did that we read earlier, but compares God to our earthly fathers. In Hebrews 12, 10 and 11, he says, "For they disciplined us for a short time, as it seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who've been trained by it." So when those kinds of events transpire in your life, it doesn't mean that God is casting you off. It doesn't mean that he's punishing you necessarily. God uses those sorts of events to prune us, to shape us for spiritual growth. In his perfect wisdom, he knows what's best for us. Right? As we just read in that passage in Hebrews, he's cultivating holiness and righteousness in us. And so in those hard times, remember that he's at work in you. Just like David says there, run to him as your banner. Pray for his help and strength. Pray for restoration and deliverance. So recognize God's discipline. The next lesson is to remember God's dominion. You know, when you think about it, art is everywhere around us. Really, even every product we buy, there's some element of design involved in it. Clothing, furniture, vehicles, electronics, even down to the packaging for things you buy. And yet those designers, those artists, don't typically get to retain any kind of ownership over their creations. They work for companies, so other peoples will come along and modify their ideas without their input or their approval. But when you think about the Lord, He's the creator of all things. He's the ultimate designer of everything we see around us. We see it in the sky and land and sea. We see it in plants and animals and every human being. It's all His. Everything that exists is His artwork, and He retains complete ownership. And in Psalm 24, verses 1 and 2, David said, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein, for He has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers." And so the prophet Jeremiah actually likens God, or receives this vision of the Lord as a potter, right? That He's the one who shapes the clay, and that He can do with it whatever He desires. He can determine the purpose for an object, and His rights of artistic ownership extends over individuals, over nations. Jeremiah 18:5-6 Jeremiah says, "Then the word of the Lord came to me, O house of Israel, can I not do with you as this potter has done, declares the Lord. Behold, like the clay in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel." Now David lived 5 centuries before Jeremiah, but as he responds to this defeat, he remembered that he really was drawn to the same truth about God, that He has dominion, that He has complete authority, that He's the owner of all things. We don't know if this was something that God revealed to David just in that moment or sometime earlier, but Psalm 60, if you take a look at verses 6-8, David wrote, "God has spoken in His holiness. With exultation I will divide up Shechem and portion out the vale of Succoth. Gilead is mine, Manasseh is mine, Ephraim is my helmet, Judah is my scepter, Moab is my wash basin, upon Edom I cast my shoe, over Philistia I shout in triumph." Now, to make sense of all that, we kind of need to understand a little bit about Israel's geography and history. Walk back through that. The first God spoke of Shechem. That was a city. It was in the center of Canaan, between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. And all the way back in Genesis 12 tells us that the Lord appeared to Abram there and promised to give the land to all of his offspring. And then the other place there, the Vale of Succoth, was on the other side of the Jordan River, the east of it. And that's where Abram's grandson Jacob came as he returned to the land. If you remember, he was running away from his brother Esau, right? That's the ancestor of these Edomites. And so these events, they happened probably 1,000 years or so before David's time. And yet they reminded him here in this moment that God had a plan, that it began long before his birth, long before his time, that the land belonged to the Lord. Right? That was the idea. And so then in verse 7, God spoke of these other places, Gilead, Manasseh, Ephraim, and Judah. And Judah was one of the sons of Jacob. Ephraim and Manasseh were Jacob's grandsons from his son Joseph. And the idea here is by the time their descendants entered into the land after the Exodus, they were each leading tribes in the land as the land was divided up. And then Gilead was that land east of the Jordan where some of the other tribes lived. And so these names, these verses, are kind of summing up the people of Israel. And God declares that they belong to Him. He says they're mine. And He determined their roles. He talks about Ephraim being his helmet. We're not exactly sure what that means, but it could have something to do with that being the tribe that the prophet Samuel came from. But then it's really clear. He says Judah is his scepter because that's the ruling tribe where David was from. And then in verse 8, God talks about these neighboring nations that were harassing the people of Israel. Moab, that was to the east, in the kind of the fertile area north of the Dead Sea. And what does God say? He considers them as nothing more than a wash bowl, a wash basin. Edom, those were the ones who were attacking from the south. He said they're like a floor mat to leave his dirty shoes on. Right? Philistia, that was a powerful nation to the west of Israel by the shore of the Mediterranean. But God says he shouts over them in victory. And so the point is that none of these attackers could undermine his promises or his plan for his people in all that he was giving them. And so we pull this back together as David considers this defeat. He's remembering that God's in charge, that all that exists belong to him, including individuals and nations. And in every event that happens, he's at work accomplishing his purpose and plan. And so there's this encouragement that he will be faithful to his promises. And so look at the way he began back in verse 6. He said God speaks in his holiness. That's the point of all this. It shows us in the light of that kind of power, of God being the creator and the owner of all things. It shows us that he's set apart, that he's awesome, that he's worthy of complete reverence. And so, well, what does that mean? I think the responding to God that way, seeing his character and what he's like, we should respond as Job did. If you've ever read the book of Job, you get to the end and the Lord appears to him after all that he's experienced, this terrible suffering. And then Job 42, 2-3 tells us that he said to the Lord, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Right? There's this sense of hushed awe, of silence before the Lord in his power. So in those moments when life seems hard, remember that God has dominion. Respond to him with that sense of humble reverence. He's in charge and he knows what he's doing. One more lesson. And it's to renew your dependence. Now it's interesting, this country Edom was located in the highlands of what we now call Jordan, the country of Jordan. And one of the world's great archaeological sites is there. It's called Petra. It's this ancient city carved into the pink sandstone cliffs, the hillsides. And even if maybe you've never heard of it, I'm sure that you've seen it because it's been in movies like Disney's live-action Aladdin or Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. The main entrance to this incredible ancient city was this narrow, winding gorge that it's about 3/4 of a mile long, and that it's as narrow as 10 feet at points, but reaches over 300 feet straight up. And so anyone who wanted to attack that city, they could be easily picked off coming through that vulnerable spot. Now, Petra probably wasn't built till a few centuries after David's time, but it demonstrates the geographical advantage that the people of Edom had, that they were in these mountains with these, canyons like this, these narrow canyons that even if Israel had superior numbers and brilliant tactics, they couldn't overcome terrain like that. And so David knew that nothing but divine intervention from the Lord would give Israel victory. And so what does he do? He renews his dependence upon the Lord. He concludes his prayer in verses 9-12 of Psalm 60 by saying this: Who will bring me to the fortified city? Who will lead me to Edom? Have you not rejected us, O God? You do not go forth, O God, with our armies. O grant us help against the foe. For vain is the salvation of man. With God we shall do valiantly. It is he who will tread down our foes. And so we know that David's prayer here was answered. Right? That was back up in the superscript, remember? Somehow the Edomites foolishly left behind the protection of that terrain and went out to fight the Israelites in the open expanse of what's called the Valley of Salt. It's directly south of the Dead Sea. And there's different accounts of that battle. 1 Chronicles 18 talks about a commander named Abishai killing 18,000 Edomites. But Abishai was under the command of his brother, Joab, and so that's who the psalm mentions. It credits the victory to Joab and says that he struck down 12,000. But then 2 Samuel 8, since David was king, just says that it was David's victory. And again, it uses the number 18,000. So it's not clear how to sort out all those differences. I'm sure there's explanations of that. But whoever was actually on hand, when you read the psalm here, you have to realize that God is the one who's ultimately responsible for their victory. And the point is that we have to depend upon God, that he uses our defeats to lead us to that kind of dependence, that kind of trust. Because what he does is he uses those things to strip away our strengths and advantages. He shows us our weaknesses and leaves us with no other choice but just to cling to him and trust that he's going to guide us through. And as humbling as that is, it's essential to our salvation. Right? I mean, in his battle, David realized that the salvation of man was vain, that it couldn't help him. And that's the same sort of realization that we have to come through when we think about our spiritual standing before God. Our best efforts to try to please him are all tainted by sin. They all fall short. Right? There's a passage in Isaiah 64:6. It says, we've all become like one who's unclean. All our righteous deeds are like a polluted garment. We all fade like a leaf, and our iniquities like the wind take us away. And so we can't rely on anything other than the Lord to save us. Right? Specifically, Jesus. Apostle Paul came to that realization. He had to see that his religious heritage and his religious deeds and works weren't sufficient to please a perfectly righteous God. He had no other choice but to look to Christ for salvation. Philippians 3:7-9, he wrote, "Whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake I've suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which comes through faith in Christ, the righteousness from God that depends on faith." So we have to ask ourselves, where is our faith? What are you trusting in? Do you think that you'll just be good enough to please God? Are you hoping that he'll just overlook your sins? That's not how it works. The perfect righteousness of God must be satisfied, and the only one who can do that is Jesus. He lived a sinless life. He died in our place on the cross. He rose from the dead. And so to be saved, to be right with God, the only way that can happen is for us to trust in him alone, the work of Christ and what he's done. And then that attitude of dependence, that's not just the starting point of the Christian life, that's everything. Right? Even when we are doing well, when we seem to be growing and experiencing spiritual victory, we have to maintain that spirit of dependence. Paul talks about it this way in 2 Corinthians 12. I'll conclude with this. He had the privilege of experiencing a vision of heaven. But in 2 Corinthians 12:7-10, he said, "So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So Paul said, therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I'm content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Would you be willing to say that? In those moments of defeat, are you willing to accept that your weaknesses, your struggles, that those are actually a strength because they forced you to depend upon God? We need to trust in the power of Christ. And so these times of defeat, they'll come. In this psalm, it's kind of a challenging one, but it still gives us these lessons, these overarching lessons to prepare us. It teaches us to recognize God's discipline, right? That we have a loving Heavenly Father who's pruning us to bear spiritual fruit. It teaches us to remember His dominion, that we need to show this holy reverence to Him as our Creator who has complete ownership over our lives and everything in the world. And then we need to continually, time and again, renew our dependence upon Him. When we're weak, we need to rely upon Him completely, because when we do, then we are truly strong. So are you living that life of faith? Are you consciously depending upon God? Or are you just kind of going through life independently? I mean, when those challenging times come, when those moments of defeat come your way, realize God's using those to get your attention. Right? Don't miss the message. Humble yourself before Him. Cry out to Him. Realize that you can't even draw near to Him to have your prayer heard apart from Jesus Christ. So I'd encourage you, if you've never done so, to start depending upon God. If you want to learn more about the life of faith, a great place to read is in Hebrews chapter 11. The author there recounts the lives of several Old Testament believers, showing how they trusted God in what seemed like impossible circumstances. And then if you are a believer, I challenge you with those words from 2 Corinthians 12. Are you content with weakness? Because that contentment in the life of a believer, that's not an expression of passivity. It's a choice to be actively dependent upon the Lord. Whenever we have those feelings of defeat, we need to choose to trust in the sovereign power and the loving discipline of God. Because by faith in Christ, when we are weak, that's when we're strong. Do you know someone who's facing times like that? If so, don't minimize their situation or the struggle. Provide a sympathetic listening ear. Pray for them. Encourage them to trust the Lord. May we all learn to be content with weakness for the glory of Christ.